On a cold February night in 2005, a woman in Chicago was sitting down for dinner when her phone rang. She looked over and saw it was her mom. So she answered it, and her mom, who lived only a few blocks away, she seemed really upset about something, and she told her daughter that she needed to come to her mother's house right now. And the daughter was like, "Why? What's going on?" But her mom cut her off and said, "No, you need to come here like right now. You need to run." And that's when the woman realized that the very thing her whole family had been so afraid of for so long might have finally happened. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do. And we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please tell the like button that you'd love to take them out to a really fancy dinner to, get all dressed up. It's going to be a great night out, but then stand them up. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the morning of February 28, 2005, a 64-year-old man named Michael Lefcow limped down the stairs inside of his home in Chicago, Illinois. He had injured his Achilles tendon playing tennis the week before. Michael had been playing a high-intensity match with his longtime friend and fellow lawyer, Robert. They played every single Saturday morning at the local indoor tennis club. Michael was running backwards to catch a deep lob, planted his foot, and felt a sudden, agonizing sensation in his heel. It felt like someone had literally kicked him as hard as they could in the back of the leg. He fell to the ground, clutching his ankle, unable to stand. He had to be helped off the court and driven to the emergency room, where the doctor confirmed he had completely ruptured his Achilles tendon. The doctor placed a massive plaster cast on his leg, and Michael was told he could not put any weight on it. He had to get around on silver crutches. For a man who was always on the go, this was incredibly frustrating. He felt trapped, and every simple movement took a massive amount of physical effort. But he tried to keep his spirits up. When Michael got into the kitchen on this cold morning, he saw his wife Joan making breakfast for the whole household. The kitchen was warm and smelled of freshly brewed coffee, frying eggs, and warm toast. Joan was a brilliant and highly respected federal judge. Being a federal judge was an incredibly demanding job with a massive amount of responsibility. Every single day, Joan had to make decisions that would change the course of people's lives forever. She had to rule on high-profile criminal cases, complex civil lawsuits, and constitutional matters. It was a heavy burden, and it could also be a very dangerous job. Michael, being an attorney himself, understood this better than anyone. He was incredibly proud of his wife, and he always did his best to support her. Together, they had raised 4 wonderful daughters. Their youngest daughter, Meg, was still a teenager and lived at home with them. She was in high school and had a very busy schedule. The other 3 daughters had grown up, finished college, and moved out to start their own independent lives, but they remained extremely close with their parents and visited often. In addition to Michael, Joan, and Meg, there was another person living in the house. This was Joan's elderly mother, Donna Humphrey. Donna was 89 years old and needed 2 canes just to walk. The previous year, she had suffered a very serious bout of sepsis. It was an extremely scary time for the entire family. Sepsis is a life-threatening condition, and given Donna's advanced age, the doctors were not sure she would survive. But Donna was a fighter, and she managed to make a full recovery. However, the illness had left her very weak and frail. She could no longer walk without the help of her canes, and she was at a high risk of falling. Joan and Michael did not want her living alone in her own home anymore. It was just too dangerous. So, they made the loving decision to invite Donna to move into their home. They had plenty of space, and they wanted to make sure they could be there to help her whenever she needed it. Donna had been living with them for about 4 or 5 months, and she was incredibly grateful for their kindness. The house was always filled with warmth, and Donna felt safe and cared for. Michael said good morning to his wife, and then he hobbled his way through the kitchen over to the dining room where Meg was finishing up her eggs. She was 17 years old, a junior in high school. She was wearing her school uniform and had her nose buried in her biology textbook, trying to do some last-minute studying before her big exam. Michael sat down next to her and they chatted for a few minutes. He asked her if she was ready for her exam, and she said she thinks so, but biology is incredibly difficult. They laughed about how Michael can barely remember high school science. Suddenly, the loud honk of a school bus echoed from the street outside. Meg jumped up from her chair, grabbed her heavy backpack, and quickly kissed her dad on the cheek. She raced past him, her shoes squeaking on the hardwood floor as she ran out the front door, letting in a blast of freezing Chicago air before slamming it shut. Michael watched her go, smiling at her youthful energy. A few moments later, Joan walked into the dining room with a plate of food for Michael and a cup of orange juice. She had made him 2 fried eggs, 2 slices of buttered wheat toast, and a tall glass of freshly squeezed orange juice. She set the plate down in front of him, and Michael thanked her. He began to eat his breakfast, enjoying the warm meal. As they sat together, Michael looked at his wife and asked her, "What's on the docket for you today?" He meant that literally because Joan was a federal judge. Joan took a sip of her coffee and began to explain her schedule. She had a busy day ahead, but it sounded like a relatively typical run-of-the-mill day for her. There were no massive, high-profile rulings scheduled, just a series of standard hearings and a mountain of legal paperwork to review. But the reality was that even a typical day for a federal judge carried a massive amount of stress. Michael knew this, and he listened intently, offering his support. At some point during their conversation, Michael told Joan that because of his injury, he actually was not going into the office today. He was going to be working from home. He said his leg was just too sore to navigate the drive to his law firm and the walk from the parking garage. He said he had several legal files that he could easily review from his desk in the basement office. Joan agreed that this was a smart decision. She did not want him driving or moving around more than necessary. Pretty soon, the two of them were just having their breakfast, and it was just a very relaxed morning. They cleaned up, and then before long, Joan was ready to go. She gathered her legal briefcases, her keys, and her coat. She said goodbye to her husband, giving him a warm hug and a kiss, and told him to take it easy and not to overexert himself. Then out the door she went, hopped in her car, and drove off to court. About half an hour later, around 9 o'clock in the morning, Michael was getting ready to start his day at the house when he saw Joan's mother, Donna, coming down the stairs. Even though his own leg was in a cast and he was in pain, Michael could not bear the thought of letting her struggle down the steep steps alone. He grabbed his silver crutches, stood up, and hobbled over to the staircase as quickly as he could. He met Donna at the bottom of the landing and gently helped her navigate the last few steps. He held her arm, ensuring she did not lose her balance. Once she was safely on the flat ground, Michael guided her over to the dining room and helped her sit in her favorite comfortable chair near the window. He made sure she was situated and asked if she wanted some breakfast or a warm drink. Donna smiled and thanked him, but she said she was perfectly fine and did not need anything else. She just wanted to rest and read for a while. Michael decided it was time to start his own workday. He gathered up his legal files, his notebook, and his pens. He held them tightly in one hand while balancing on his crutches with the other. He began the slow walk toward the basement stairs. The stairs leading down to the basement were located near the back of the house. Michael opened the door, turned on the light, and looked down. He took a deep breath, knowing that going downstairs with a ruptured Achilles tendon and crutches was incredibly difficult. He had to be extremely careful. He placed his crutches on the step below, shifted his weight, and lowered his cast-bound leg. He repeated this slow, rhythmic process for every single step. The clunking sound of his crutches on the wooden steps was the only noise in the quiet house. When Michael finally reached the bottom of the basement stairs, he found himself in a finished basement. There was a long hallway that led to several doors. He hobbled down the hallway until he reached the door to his home office. He opened the door, stepped inside, and went and sat down at his desk. Michael spread his legal files across the desk. He picked up the first folder and began to read through the documents, focusing his mind on his legal work. The basement was very quiet, with only the distant hum of the home's heating system. But as Michael sat there, engrossed in his reading, he suddenly heard a strange sound. It was a very soft, subtle rustling noise. Michael stopped reading and held his breath. He listened closely. The sound seemed to be coming from the utility closet located inside his office. The door to the utility closet was closed. Michael stared at the closed door. He waited, wondering if he had just imagined the sound. But then it happened again. It was a distinct rustling, like something or someone shifting around inside the tight space of the closet. Michael began to wonder what it could be. He thought that perhaps the home's furnace, which was housed inside the utility closet, was making some unusual mechanical sounds. Or maybe a stray animal, like a mouse or a squirrel, had somehow found its way inside. But for some reason, the sound felt odd to him. He felt a sudden urge to find out exactly what was making that noise. He grabbed his silver crutches, pulled himself up from his leather chair, and hobbled slowly across the office floor. He stopped right in front of the utility closet door. He could hear the faint rustling sound continuing on the other side. Michael reached out, wrapped his hand around the metal doorknob, turned it, and opened the door. At 5 o'clock that night, Michael's wife, Joan, walked through the parking garage at the federal courthouse and got into her car. She was carrying her heavy briefcases, and she felt incredibly exhausted after a long day of legal arguments and administrative duties. But more than anything, Joan felt a growing sense of anxiety. She was feeling a bit unsettled because she had called Michael a couple of times that afternoon, but there had been no answer. This was just really unlike him. Even if he was busy, he always kept his phone nearby, especially now that he was recovering from a major injury and staying home to look after her mother. In fact, this was so unusual that Joan had actually gotten in touch with her daughter Meg after the school day ended and asked her, have you been in touch with Dad? And Meg said that she hadn't, but she had gone home after school and she had grabbed some workout clothes in the house before leaving again. And she said when she was in the house, she had not seen her dad or Joan's mom, so her grandmother, Donna. Meg said the house was completely quiet, and she had assumed that her dad and grandmother were asleep upstairs or something, so she did not want to disturb them and left. This did not make Joan feel any better. In fact, it only made her more anxious. It took Joan about half an hour to drive home through the heavy Chicago traffic. And when she pulled into the driveway around 5:30 that night, it was getting dark. She noticed that the front of the house was mostly dark, with only a few interior lights casting a dim glow. She quickly parked her car, got out, and walked up the front steps. Her heart was beating fast. She unlocked the heavy front door and stepped into the warm entryway. The house was completely silent. Joan set her briefcases down and immediately called out for Michael, but there was no answer. She called out for her mom, Donna. There was no answer. And so she walked around the first floor. Again, no sign of any issues here. Her husband and her mom were not around. Donna's empty teacup was still sitting on the table, but Donna was nowhere to be found. She eventually makes her way upstairs, hoping to find them asleep in their beds, but she gets up there and she checks the bedrooms and all the rooms upstairs, and there's no one up there. And so the only place left to look in the house was the basement. But at this hour, it just made no sense that Michael or her mom would be in the basement. Donna could not navigate the steep stairs, and Michael had no reason to stay down there all day without coming up. And so eventually, even though she felt really uneasy, she went back to the first floor. She went to the doorway that led down to the stairs into the basement. She opened the door and stared down into the dark stairwell. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. She reached out and flipped the light switch, illuminating the wooden steps. She called out for Michael and her mom, but still no answer. And then down the stairs she went, her footsteps heavy on the wooden steps. When she got to the base of the stairs, she looked down that hallway that led to Michael's office, and she saw at first there was nothing. She didn't see anything. But on the floor, right outside of Michael's office, she saw what looked like a large, dark pool of red liquid on the ground. It was blood. And so at this point, she panicked. She ran down the hallway, her shoes slapping against the floor. She's screaming for Michael. She grabs the door handle, she opens it up, and what she saw in there was so shocking, so utterly horrifying, that her brain simply couldn't process it. It was like a nightmare. She saw two bodies lying on the floor in a massive, spreading pool of blood. The horror of the sight was too much for her to bear, and she just shut the door right away, blocking the horrific scene from her sight. She couldn't handle what she had just seen. And then a moment later, she had bolted back upstairs, ran into the kitchen, grabbed her phone, and called 911. In the late evening of February 28, 2005, Special Agent Douglas Seacom of the Chicago FBI office ducked under the crime scene tape around the Lefcow family's home. The street was lined with police cars, their red and blue lights flashing against the dark houses. Scom parked his car, got out, and adjusted his coat against the freezing Chicago wind. He walked up to the edge of the crime scene tape and ducked underneath it. Scom had received an urgent call about a double homicide at the home of a federal judge. This was an incredibly high-priority case. An attack on a federal judge or their family was considered an attack on the entire federal government and the judicial system. So about 30 minutes earlier, the 911 call had come out of this home from Joan about what appeared to be a murder at this address. And since the caller, Joan, had identified herself as a federal judge, the Chicago police had immediately called the FBI to take part in this investigation. And so now, Special Agent Seacom flashed his badge to one of the uniformed officers who was standing outside right near the edge of the crime scene tape. And he asked them, "Where is Judge Joan Lefcow?" And the officer said that Judge Joan, along with her teenage daughter, Meg, and her 3 adult daughters who had rushed to the scene, they had all been taken together to a secure safe house by the United States Marshals Service. The Marshals had immediately taken custody of the family to ensure their safety, as they did not know if the killer was still out there targeting the judge. And so Seacom, after hearing this, stepped inside the house, and he found a whole bunch of forensic teams already hard at work, sweeping every room for evidence. He walked into the warm entryway and looked around. The home was filled with forensic investigators and technicians. They were busy dusting for fingerprints, taking photographs, and searching every room for potential evidence. And as he walked through the living room and the kitchen on the main floor, he didn't see any signs of blood or a struggle of any kind. He noticed that everything was in its proper place. There were no overturned chairs, no broken dishes, and no signs of forced entry on the main doors or windows. He also saw that valuable items, including a television and other expensive-looking electronics, were still in place. And so he didn't think this was a robbery gone wrong. The killer had not come to steal anything. They had come with a specific purpose. Seacom eventually found his way to the stairs that led down into the basement. And so down he went, and he found there were a few officers and a crime scene photographer that were down there gathered around a door that was at the end of the hallway. They were speaking in low, serious voices. And so Seacom made his way down the hallway. He pushed past the group of people, and there, inside of this home office, he saw 2 dead bodies. There was a man who was lying face down, and then right next to him was also an elderly woman who was lying face up, and there was just a big pool of blood underneath both of them. Seacom immediately noticed that both the victims had fairly obvious gunshot wounds to their heads. And then when he knelt down to get a better look, he also found shell casings scattered around on the floor. So he figured that very likely these two clearly had been shot, but more specifically, they've been shot and killed in this room. On the other side of this office, Seacom saw there was a closet and its doors were open and it appeared to be a utility closet. And so Seacom, he walked over and he stepped inside, and inside of it was this big furnace and water heater, and then next to it on the ground he found there was a cardboard 12-pack of beer bottles, except one of the bottles was missing. And so Seacom looked around inside the closet. He didn't see the 12th bottle on the floor of the closet. And then he turned around and looked back into the office, and as he's looking back into the office, he notices there's this window high up inside of the office, and it actually was out to the ground floor, because this is a basement. This is a window that leads to the first floor of the house on the outside. And there is a wide wooden windowsill inside of the office, like a ledge that is part of this window. So you could actually place things on this windowsill if you wanted to. And he looked up into this window and he saw there was a single open beer bottle sitting on that windowsill on that ledge. And also he saw the window itself was shattered. And so right away, Seacom's thinking like, okay, did the killer leave behind this beer? And if so, why? Like, is this a message? Are they leaving the bottle here on purpose for us to find it? Or is this a mistake? It seemed incredibly sloppy. It was almost like a joke or a deliberate message left for the investigators. Or perhaps the killer was simply so unstable or intoxicated that they did not realize the massive mistake they were making. And so Seacom, he called for a forensics officer to come over and bag this additional bottle, the 12th bottle, and swab it for DNA and fingerprints in case this was left by the killer. And so the forensics officer carefully retrieved the bottle and placed this bottle inside of a plastic bag. And then he asked Seacom to leave the office and head upstairs for a minute so that he and his team could spray the entire basement with a chemical called leucocrystal violet, which can illuminate traces of blood that are not necessarily visible to the naked eye. This powerful chemical reacts with the hemoglobin in blood, turning a bright purple-violet color and revealing if someone has attempted to wipe away or clean up blood from a surface. And so as Seacom left the office and began making his way upstairs, he began thinking about what he had just learned. So you have a broken window leading into the home office where it appears the shooting took place. And the fact that the window was broken does suggest that's how the killer or killers got in. And if that's the case, it likely means the killer or killers did not know the victims personally. They didn't have a key to the house, for example, or they weren't going to be let in if they showed up at the front door. But then you have this weird beer bottle thing, like if the killer left behind beer in that utility closet and this extra beer bottle up on the ledge of the window, that feels really sloppy. And so that's sort of at odds with the idea that this was like an intentional outsider coming to do this hit. And then he's also thinking like, the elephant in the room here is that Judge Joan Lefcow, this is her husband and her mother. Was that intentional? Were they trying to sort of indirectly hurt Judge Joan, or was Judge Joan the target, or was this a coincidence? An hour later, while forensics teams were still searching the crime scene, Seacom went out to canvass the neighborhood. The chemical spray that the forensics team had sprayed in the basement after Seacom left had in fact revealed additional traces of blood all over the basement hallway. So, it looked like at least one of the victims had actually been shot in the hallway and then moved into the office. And then the killer apparently had cleaned the hallway afterwards, using water or cleaning chemicals to wash it away, but obviously this chemical had still revealed the blood traces. And so Seacom thought to himself that if the killer or killers stuck around to clean up after themselves, it suggests that they went into this home with the intention of committing murder. It was just a matter of why. Was Joan the target? Was it her loved ones? Why did that happen? Who would want to harm the Lefcows? And so Seacom went down the street knocking on doors and speaking to various neighbors trying to get a feel for what the Lefcows were like. The cold night air was biting, but Seacom walked from house to house, knocking on doors and speaking to the residents. He asked them if they had seen or heard anything unusual during the day. But after speaking to many people on the block who tried to be very helpful, Seacom really hadn't learned much of anything. Like, no one really had all that much to say. Most of the neighbors were shocked to hear about the murders, but they had not seen anything suspicious. The Lefcows were well liked, and the neighborhood was usually very safe and quiet. No one had heard gunshots, which was not surprising since the shooting had taken place deep in the basement. But eventually, Seacom found his way to a church that was in the neighborhood, and he knocked on the door, and a moment later, the pastor opened the door. Seacom identified himself as an FBI agent and explained that unfortunately a double murder had taken place down the block and they were here investigating, and asked, "Have you seen or heard anything unusual in the past several hours?" And the pastor at first is just totally taken back by what he's been told. He can't believe it. But then he's like, you know what? Actually, yeah, something strange did happen earlier today. The pastor said he had seen this car just loitering nearby that had two men inside of it, and they were apparently smoking and drinking cans of what appeared to be Coca-Cola, but they just sort of didn't fit in with the neighborhood. Like, the pastor didn't know who they were, and it just seemed sort of odd that they were here. And so, just considering what he's been told about this double murder, he basically said, you might want to look into who those guys were. And so Seacom asked the pastor if he'd gotten a good enough look at these two men to maybe be able to help their sketch artists come up with a composite sketch. And the pastor said, yeah, I think so. And so Seacom's like, okay, great, we're going to do that. But also, can you specifically point out where this car was like outside so I can go look at the area? And the pastor, he pointed across the street and he said, right over there. And so Seacom, he looks where the pastor is pointing, and sure enough, he could see on the ground there were all these cigarette butts and clearly an empty Coke can. It was clear that someone had been sitting there for a while. And so Seacom called over a forensics team and they scooped the stuff up, placing them in evidence bags, and they sent it off to the lab to be tested for DNA and fingerprints. Later that same night, Seacom sat down at a table at the safe house where Joan and her daughters were all staying. The safe house was a secure, undisclosed location designed to protect high-profile targets. Seacom was led inside and found Joan sitting at a wooden table. Joan, she walked over and set a glass of water in front of him, and then she sat down across from him. She looked incredibly tired and her eyes were red from crying, but she also appeared remarkably calm and composed. Seacom thought Joan seemed surprisingly calm and composed considering her husband and her mother have just been brutally murdered. But he also could sense that underneath the surface of Joan's sort of calm effect, she seemed furious. And so Seacom and Joan, they spoke a little bit about this great tragedy and how awful this was. However, pretty quickly, Seacom just sort of got into asking pointed questions of Joan, and Joan answered them. Seacom asked Joan about the 12-pack of beer that was in the utility closet in the basement, and she told him it was left over from a party that they had thrown earlier that same week, and she said she was the one who actually put those beers in the closet. She was absolutely certain that all 12 bottles were sealed and unopened when she put them there. And this was great news for Seacom's investigation because that meant that the beer up on that windowsill in the basement almost certainly was handled by the killer or killers. It proved that the killer had indeed opened one of the bottles and drank from it while inside the house. But still, the idea of somebody breaking into this house and stumbling across some beer in the closet and stopping to actually have a drink right in the middle of committing a double murder and then leaving the beer bottle behind, it just felt like a really weird decision to make. And so Seacom wondered if maybe there was something at play here that literally prevented the killer from thinking clearly in the moment, like mental illness or maybe drug use. So at this point, Seacom had already come to the conclusion that very likely Donna, Joan's elderly mother, was not the intended target. She's 89. She doesn't have any known enemies. She's not hurting anyone. She's not a target here. But perhaps Michael, Joan's husband, could have been the target. After all, at one point, he had actually run for Cook County judge a few years ago. And even though he had lost, entering politics was a surefire way to make enemies. So it was possible he could have been the target and Donna was collateral damage, but most likely of all still was that Joan was the one being targeted. Seacom knew that as a federal judge, there could be literally hundreds of people holding very serious grudges against her. And so Seacom told Joan that back at the command post, there was a team of detectives going through her entire docket and making a list of everyone who might have had a ruling that they were not happy with in the past few years. But maybe to help speed things along, he asked Joan if she could think of anybody off the top of her head who might have been responsible for this. And Joan, sort of without hesitation, said, yeah, in fact, there were 3 cases that came to mind. The first case was about a guy named Sean Peters, who was the leader of a local gang. And Joan had given him a very lengthy prison sentence. And so she said any of his fellow gang members in theory could have come after her in retaliation. The second case she brought up was about this armed robber whose name was Richard Young, and she said he just really scared her in the courtroom, like he himself was just a very intimidating and sort of threatening person. During his courtroom appearances, Young had behaved in a highly aggressive manner. He had made direct eye contact with her and had made threatening gestures that left her feeling deeply unsettled. And so he seemed capable of doing something like this, and she said the third case was about Matthew Hale. Before she even got into the explanation, Seacom recognized the name because at the time Hale was one of the most notorious white supremacists in all of Illinois. He was the head of a group called the World Church of the Creator. 6 years earlier, one of his followers, a man named Benjamin Smith, had committed this horrible shooting spree that left 2 people dead and 9 others injured. Joan said that Hale had actually targeted her a couple of years ago in the wake of this trademark dispute. A peaceful church in Oregon with the same name as Hale's group had sued them, and Joan had actually enforced a ruling that forced Hale to change his group's name. Joan said that just the year before, Hale had actually been convicted of plotting to kill her over this issue. Joan said he was still in prison for those charges, so Seacom realized he could not have pulled the trigger himself, but clearly he had many followers who were willing to do things like this for him. It was highly possible that one of them had decided to carry out the murder plot that Hale had been convicted of planning. They may have targeted her home, and when they did, they ended up killing her husband and her mother's instead. Seacom agreed that this was an incredibly strong lead. The hatred and violence associated with Hale's group made them prime suspects in a double homicide. The next day, so March 1st, Seacom sat down with notorious white supremacist Matthew Hale in a visiting room at the federal prison in Chicago where he was incarcerated. Hale was this very clean-cut, very stern-looking man in his mid-30s, and he didn't seem remotely rattled to be sitting across from an FBI agent who basically was insinuating that Hale was a potential suspect in a double homicide. And so Seacom told Hale about how Joan Lefcow's husband and her elderly mother had been brutally murdered inside of her home. And in response, Hale just laughed. He smiled and told Seacom that he and his followers had absolutely nothing to do with those murders. He claimed that he was in prison and had no way of orchestrating such an event, and he insisted that his organization was peaceful. But this was more or less what Seacom had expected Hale to say, because Hale was actually still awaiting sentencing for having tried to kill Joan. So of course he's not going to admit here to arranging another murder. He's going to say, "No, I had nothing to do with it." Seacom told him that it really didn't matter if he denied this, because at this very moment agents were seizing his phone and computer records, and if he had said anything at all about Joan Lefcow and her family to any of his followers, they would find out. But Hale, he just sat back and smiled and continued to insist that he's like, "Look, I really had nothing to do with this one. Like, nothing at all. You will find nothing." And Seacom couldn't help but think that Hale seemed so calm and so confident that really deep down he thought to himself, maybe he's telling the truth. Seacom left the prison feeling a sense of frustration. Hale's confidence was unsettling. Later that same afternoon, Seacom hunched over a desk in the corner of the Chicago Police Command Post. At this point, the police, the FBI, and the U.S. Marshals were all working on this case as part of a joint task force, and all the officers on the task force had moved their equipment into the police precinct so the investigation could be centralized. In a conference room to his left, Seacom could see police officers comparing photos of Matthew Hale's followers to the composite sketches of the two men in the red car who the pastor had seen near the crime scene. And at a desk to Seacom's right, there was another FBI agent who was listening to a recording of a phone call that Hale had recently made to his mother. The FBI at this point was taping all of Hale's phone calls in case he said anything incriminating. And meanwhile, other task force officers were sorting through this huge pile of letters that Hale had received in prison. However, after going through these letters, there was no mention of the Lefcows anywhere. However, at some point, Seacom would join these other officers and continue to sort through all this mail in case something got missed. It was a tedious process, looking through hundreds of letters, most of them filled with hateful rhetoric and legal complaints. And as he was sorting through months' worth of mail, something actually did catch his attention. For months, Hale had been exchanging letters with this woman whose name was Kathleen Robertazzo. Basically, every other day they were speaking, and Hale did not write to anybody else nearly that often, not even his own family. So, this woman was clearly very important. Now, on the surface, nothing in these letters between Hale and Kathleen was incriminating. However, given the frequency of communication, Seacom had to wonder if maybe these two could be talking in code. Like maybe they are talking about the Lefcows, but we just can't tell. The return address on these letters was for a suburb in Chicago, about 30 miles away from the prison where Hale was at. So Seacom bundled up all the letters from Kathleen and stuck them inside of an envelope. He would need them as evidence to get a search warrant. He suspected they might be using a sophisticated code, and Kathleen might be serving as a messenger or a central point of contact for Hale's followers. The next evening, March 2nd, 2005, Special Agent Douglas Seacom led a team of FBI agents up the driveway of a suburban home just outside of Chicago. And as they made their way up the driveway, they saw the car parked that was red, just like the car the pastor had seen outside the church that had been loitering near where Michael and Donna had been killed. This gets their hearts racing. Could this be the red car the pastor saw? Seacom made his way up to the front door and he knocked. And then a moment later, a woman answered and he said, "Are you Kathleen Robertazzo?" And she said, "Yes." And he said, "Okay." And he held up a search warrant and he said, "We're here to search your house." And so Seacom stayed outside with Kathleen while the other agents went and swept the whole house. Kathleen appeared annoyed by this whole thing, but definitely not that surprised. And so while the team was searching the home, Seacom turned to Kathleen and asked her about her relationship with Matthew Hale. And he also asked her if she agreed with his white supremacist views. Kathleen admitted that she did have a relationship with Matthew, but she corrected Seacom and said, I'm not a white supremacist. I'm a white separatist." Seacom sighed and moved on to asking Kathleen about her whereabouts on the day of Michael and Donna's murders. And Kathleen insisted that she had nothing to do with that. She gave Seacom her alibi for the whole day of February 28th, explaining where she had been and who she had been with. And while Seacom was writing down the details on his notepad, the other agents came back out of the house carrying a computer. When Kathleen began complaining that she needed that computer for her work, Seacom told her that they'd return it as soon as they searched it for evidence. And then, before Seacom put his notepad away, he walked over and looked down to the driveway, and he looked at Kathleen's red car, and he remembered that he actually hadn't written down the license plate or the make or the model. But as he's looking at this car, he's realizing that there's no way this car matched the description of the pastor's red car that he had seen loitering outside of the church. Like, this was definitely not the same car that was suspected of being involved in the murder. It was a completely different make and model. It was a common car, and there was no way it was the same one seen near the church. 2 days later, on the evening of Friday, March 4th, so now 4 days after Michael and Donna were killed, Special Agent Seacom carried a cup of coffee into a meeting room with the other officers on the task force. He looked around the room and everybody just looked completely exhausted. It would turn out Kathleen's alibi had checked out, and her red car was definitely not the red car that had been spotted by the pastor. And there had been nothing on her computer that they had taken to search, so basically she was cleared. And so Seacom and his fellow FBI agents over the past couple of days, this is right after Kathleen was cleared, they had gone ahead and expanded their search and began interviewing more and more of Matthew Hale's followers, and a lot of them were very confrontational, and at least 3 people were detained for starting fights with the investigators. But one by one, their alibis began to check out, and so none of them were tied to Michael and Donna's murders, at least not yet. Now, a lot of Hale's followers had criminal records, so Seacom was hoping that maybe once fingerprint evidence came back from the crime lab, it would turn up a match. But deep down, realistically, Seacom was starting to doubt that anybody in Hale's circle was behind this. Additionally, the task force had investigated that gang leader Joan had mentioned, Sean Peters, as well as that armed robber Richard Young, and they both also had been cleared as suspects. They both had solid alibis and were ruled out. And so now, Seacom couldn't help but feel like, we're 4 days into this investigation, this pretty high-profile investigation, and it sort of seems like we really don't have much to show for it. Now, it was the case that there were still dozens of other people on Joan's court docket that maybe could have wanted to kill her that Joan was not aware of, but, it was going to take time to keep sorting through all these people. And right now, they didn't have traction in any one direction. It was like everything was sort of becoming a dead end. And so as Seacom is sitting in this room full of the other agents and they're all sort of at a loss for what to do next, he was thinking to himself, is it possible that we've all just sort of wrongfully jumped to conclusions? We all basically assumed that this attack was targeted at Joan. But Seacom, thinking to himself, he couldn't remember any other case where a judge's family was killed and not the judge themselves. Just then, Seacom's supervisor from the Chicago FBI office kicked off the meeting by announcing that the agency was putting up a $50,000 reward to the public for information on the murders. Now, the task force by this point had received over 200 tips, but the supervisor said, clearly that wasn't enough. And so we're going to use this reward to try to entice people who might have been too afraid to come forward. We'll pay them. And so hopefully this leads to better tips the next Tuesday. So 9 days after Michael and Donna's murders, Seacom walked into the command post. The task force had been working all weekend following up on hundreds and hundreds of calls that had come in since the reward money was announced, but it still didn't really seem like they were getting anywhere. And so Seacom, he sat down at his desk and he opened up a folder and he was about to get started when his cell phone rang and he answered it, and it was the deputy director of the crime lab. And so Seacom's heart began to pound with anticipation as the deputy director told him that they had analyzed those fingerprints found on that beer bottle in the basement of the crime scene up in the window ledge. And after they had run it through the database, they had found a match. The killer was a man named Bart Ross. Based on forensic evidence and a confession from the killer, this is what police believe happened to Michael Lefcow and Donna Humphrey on February 28, 2005. Around 4:30 in the morning, while everybody in the Lefcow house was still asleep, the killer, Bart Ross, parked his van a short distance from the house. He walked quietly through the dark, cold yard, carrying a handgun and a bag of tools. He reached the side of the house and found a small, narrow basement window that was low to the ground. Ross used a tool to quietly shatter the glass of the window. He carefully cleared away the sharp shards, and then, with great effort, he climbed through the small opening and dropped down into the basement. With him was a gun. His plan was to hide in the utility closet all day. And then, once everybody inside the house cleared out, they would leave the utility closet, sneak upstairs, and they would wait. And when the time was right, they would jump out and they would ambush the person that they wanted to seek revenge on. He wanted to kill Joan Lefcow, but things did not go according to plan. Around 9 o'clock in the morning, the killer was still in the closet when they heard footsteps coming downstairs, coming down the hallway, and into the office where they were. Ross had stood in the dark, cramped utility closet for hours. He had listened carefully to the sounds of the house waking up. He heard the footsteps on the floorboards above him. He heard the muffled voices of Michael, Joan, and Meg as they had breakfast. He heard the school bus honk, and he heard Meg leave the house. A A short while later, he heard Joan pack her things and walk out the front door. He believed that the house would now be completely empty, or at least that his path was clear. But what Ross did not know was that Michael was staying home that day because of his ruptured Achilles tendon, and then they heard the sound of somebody sitting in that desk chair and papers shuffling around. And then a moment later, they heard the sound of footsteps as somebody approached the closet. And then before long, the closet doors opened and there was this man standing there looking really surprised. He was on crutches and he's looking at the killer. Ross was trapped inside the closet, realizing he could not leave without being seen. He had hoped Michael would eventually go back upstairs, but when Michael opened the door, the killer just panicked and they raised their gun and they shot this man point blank in the head and he crumpled to the ground. And the killer's looking down and there's just blood going everywhere and they're like, I can't believe what I've done. And then a moment later, the killer hears somebody calling out, Michael, Michael, is that you? Upstairs, 89-year-old Donna had heard the loud, muffled crack of the gunshot. She was deeply concerned. She slowly stood up, using her 2 canes, and made her way toward the basement door. She opened the door and began to slowly call out for Michael. She managed to take a few steps down the stairs. And the killer looks down the hallway and he sees this elderly woman shuffling down the hallway looking really concerned, who clearly just heard the gunshot. And sort of in a continued state of panic, the killer rushed out of the closet, went down the hallway, raised the gun, and shot this woman in the head as well. And as Donna is bleeding all over the hallway, the killer put their gun away, reached down, scooped her up, and dragged her over into the office and sort of dropped her next to Michael. At this point, the killer's looking down at what they've done, and they're thinking, well, at this point, I better make sure they really are dead. So, they pull out their gun again, then they shoot Donna and Michael one more time just to make sure they would not talk to anyone about what they had seen. After that, the killer went back into the utility closet and their eyes landed on that pack of beer sitting on the floor, and they felt like that was exactly what they needed right now to calm their nerves. The panic and adrenaline were surging through his body. He felt incredibly anxious and hot. So they reached down and they pulled out one of those beers and they cracked it open and they took a sip while they thought about what their next move was going to be. And so as the killer is drinking this beer, they're thinking to themselves, well, I've just killed 2 people that I did not intend to kill. Those were not my targets. And so they felt kind of bad, like 2 basically innocent people had been murdered here. And so it made the killer think like, should I still stick around and wait for my intended target? And eventually they decided, you know what, I need to change my plan. I cannot stay in this house with 2 dead bodies. I need to clean up the scene and escape. And so the killer, they set their beer bottle down on the windowsill. Then they went and found a sponge and some bleach in the house. And they began to try to clean up all the blood in the hallway. But as they're doing this, they're realizing there's just so much blood out here. There's bodies and lots more blood in the office. Like, this is too much. Like, I can't possibly clean all this. The bleach was simply not enough to hide the stains. And so finally, around 1:15 in the afternoon, the killer just sort of was like, well, this is as good as I can do in terms of cleanup. I'm just gonna leave. And so they did. They climbed back out through the shattered basement window, got into his van, and drove away. They left the house and they left behind that bottle in the windowsill that would have their DNA and fingerprints all over it. The killer was a man named Bart Ross, and his intended target was Joan Lefcow. But Bart was not like a hardened criminal. Bart was a 57-year-old cancer patient who had tried to sue his doctors after he lost part of his jaw during treatment. Ross had developed a vendetta against these doctors who had left him disfigured, and he was in constant, agonizing pain. And over the last few years, he'd become increasingly paranoid and detached from reality. And he ultimately blamed Joan Lefcow for dismissing his medical malpractice suit and preventing him from getting justice. He had become completely consumed by a desire for revenge against the entire legal and medical system. And so Bart had put together this list of 25 doctors, lawyers, and judges he wanted to kill. And Joan just happened to be at the top of the list, but after going into her home with the intent to kill Joan, but actually just killing Michael and Donna, Ross was so shaken up by it that he gave up on attacking Joan and just left the scene. But he obviously left behind crucial clues that got him caught. Ross's fingerprints and DNA were found inside of Joan's home, not just on that beer bottle, but elsewhere in the house. However, his fingerprints and DNA were not found on those cigarette butts in the Coke can that was left on the curb where that suspicious red car had been parked. And also, Ross looked nothing like the composite sketches of those 2 men that were seen inside of that red car. So in the end, the investigators believed that the red car probably had nothing to do with the murders and Ross simply acted alone. The suspicious red car with the 2 men drinking Coke was entirely a coincidence. On March 9th, one day after the fingerprint results came back, Wisconsin police officers spotted Ross's van near a federal courthouse in Milwaukee. They suspected he might be planning another attack on one of the other targets on his list. But as they approached his van, Ross realized he was trapped, and he fatally shot himself in the head, committing suicide. However, inside of his van, police found a detailed suicide note and a confession letter. In the note, he confessed in detail to the murders of Michael Lefcow and Donna Humphrey. He took full responsibility for their deaths and expressed remorse for killing them, stating that they were innocent and were not his intended targets, and that he had only wanted to kill the judge who had dismissed his lawsuit. The tragedy left deep, permanent scars on Joan Lefcow and her daughters. The loss of a loving husband and a devoted mother in such a senseless, violent manner was almost too much to bear. It served as a stark, horrifying reminder of the extreme dangers faced by those who work within the judicial system and the devastating impact of one man's obsession with revenge. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya!